My dear 11th class economic students, Assalamu alaikum. In today's lecture, we will be talking about the major economic reforms which took place in India in 1991. It's also called the New Economic Policy of 1991. Let's first understand the meaning of economic reforms. Students, economic reforms refers to a set of economic policies adopted and directed to accelerate the pace of economic growth and development. In other words, we can define it as changes introduced by the government of a country in order to improve the economic conditions through various measures and policies. So it indicates necessary structural adjustments to external events in order to take the economy on a high growth path and make the economy more flexible. In Indian context, economic reforms refers to deregulation, that is to take the Indian economy out of government regulations, to minimize the role of government in economic activities, and to remove distortions caused by regulations or the presence of government rather than new or increased regulations or government programs to reduce distortions caused by market failure. Now, coming to the Indian economic reforms adopted by Indian government in 1991, which is also called the New Economic Policy of 1991. Dear students, the government of India initiated a series of economic reforms in the year 1991 to pull the Indian economy out of economic crisis of 90s. These reforms came to be known as New Economic Policy of 1991. The major goal of New Economic Policy was to make the Indian economy more market oriented, to expand the role of private sector and foreign investment, to improve the productivity and profitability of Indian economy, and to make the Indian economy globally competitive. Students, as we already discussed in our previous lectures, that before 1990, that is in the pre-reform period, India adopted a socialistic pattern of society. Public sector was given the major role in the process of growth and development. The main strategic industries were under the control of public sector. Industry and trade were subjected to many restrictions via industrial licensing system, quotas of production and permits of exports and imports. In connection of inward looking trade strategy, that is the import substitution policy adopted by Indian government before 1990, a very restrictive import policy was being adopted under which imports were protected by imposition of tariffs and quotas, which eventually protected the domestic industries from foreign competition. We cannot deny the fact that the restrictive policy of licenses, permits and quotas adopted by Indian government in pre-reform period initially rendered some help in accelerating the pace of industrial development in India, but with the passage of time, the bad effects of restrictive policies had started overshadowing the good effects. Public sector enterprises became the centers of corruption and inefficiencies, and due to protection from foreign competition, the domestic industry failed to diversify and modernize. In nutshell, we can say that the economic policy adopted by Indian government up to 1990 failed in many aspects and landed the country in an unprecedented economic crisis. The end result was the stagnation of Indian economy by the end of June 1991. This situation was so alarming that Indian foreign exchange reserves were merely enough to pay for only 2 weeks' imports. The revenues generated by Indian government were not adequate to meet the growing expenses. In order to meet the growing expenses and to pay for its debts, the government of India resorted to borrowing, thus eventually was caught in a debt trap. New loans were not available and there was an erosion of confidence of international investors in the Indian economy. Industrial growth was very low while prices of essential commodities were very high. Because of the combined effects of all these factors, economic reforms became inevitable in India and were the only way to move Indian economy out of this crisis. In general, the main factors which necessitated the need for the Indian economic reforms are mentioned in this slide. First important factor responsible for economic reforms was the increase in fiscal deficit as government expenditures grew faster than government revenue. Fiscal deficit, it is the difference between total revenue and total expenditure of government in a financial year excluding borrowings. It is an indication of the total borrowings needed by the government. Students throughout 1980s, fiscal deficit of India was getting worse due to increase in Indian non-development expenditures. During the 1980s, the growth rate of India was accelerated by borrowings but without any drastic restructuring of the economy. As a result, fiscal deficit of India rose from 5.4% of gross domestic product in 1980 to 81 to 8.4% of GDP in 1990 to 91. A major portion of this deficit was financed by borrowings, both from external and internal sources. The increased borrowings resulted in increasing public debt and interest payment obligations. This in turn aggravated the problem of internal as well as external indebtedness. The external debt of India rose from 12% of GDP in 1980 to 81 to 23% of GDP in 1990 to 91. And domestic borrowings, that is the internal borrowings by government, increased from 35% of GDP to 49.8% of GDP during 1980-81 to 1990 to 91. Moreover, the interest payment obligations on the public borrowings rose from 10% of total government expenditure in 1980 to 81 to 36.4% of total government expenditure in 1990 to 91. As a result, India lost its financial worthiness in the international market and fell in a debt trap. Thus, in order to restore the fiscal discipline in the economy, economic reforms were needed very badly. Second important factor responsible for economic reforms in India was worsening balance of payment situation. Students, balance of payment is a system of recording countries' economic transactions with the rest of the world over a period of 1 year. It represents the difference between total receipts for exports and total payments for imports of a country on account of its economic transactions with the rest of the world. Dear students, due to the policy of protection pursued by Indian government before 1990, our exports could not compete in price and quality in international market. Although government granted different kinds of incentives to the exporters under export promotion schemes, our exports could not rise to the desired extent. Against the slow growth of exports, there was a rapid increase in imports in the pre-reform period. As a result, India was not able to earn enough foreign exchange through exports to finance its imports. Excess of payments for imports or receipts for exports led to the deficit in balance of payment of India, which had been rising continuously since 1980 to 81. For instance, current account deficit in balance of payment of India increased from 1.35% of GDP in 1980 to 81 to 3.69% of GDP in 1990 to 91. In order to finance this huge current account deficit, Indian government borrowed a huge amount from the rest of the world. Consequently, the foreign loans, or we can say the external debt, which were 12% of GDP in 1980-81, it rose to 23% of GDP in 1990 to 91. On the other hand, Indian exports were not enough to earn sufficient foreign exchange to repay these external debt obligations. In 1980 to 81, foreign debt service, that is the repayment of foreign loan installments along with interest payments, it constituted 15% of Indian export earnings, while it increased to 30% of export earnings in 1990 to 91. This caused a severe depletion of forex, that is the foreign exchange reserves of India. So we can say that this severe crisis in balance of payment compelled the need for the economic reforms. Crisis in Gulf countries is another factor responsible for adverse balance of payment of India and thus necessitated the need for economic reforms. Students, on account of the Iraq War in 1990 to 91, world oil prices increased drastically and remittances from Indian workers in the Gulf region fell sharply as many of these workers left the region due to war. Gulf War thus further worsened the balance of payment crisis and compelled the Indian government to opt for economic reforms. Dear students, the increased burden of foreign debt service and outflow of capital due to Gulf War had put extreme pressure on Indian foreign exchange reserves. By mid 1991, India's foreign exchange reserves had declined to just 2 weeks of import coverage, which means that these were not enough to pay for an import bill of more than 2 weeks. Forex reserves, that is the foreign exchange reserves that were rupees 8,151 crore in 1986 to 87 declined sharply to rupees 6,252 crores in 1989 to 90. The situation grew so worse that Chandrasekhara government, which headed India between 10 November 1990 to 21 June 1991, had to mortgage country's gold reserves with the World Bank in order to discharge its foreign debt servicing obligations. In such a state of crisis, the Indian government had to helplessly resort to the policy of liberalization as suggested by the World Bank. Rise in prices, or we can say the high level of inflation in India, was one more factor responsible for economic reforms in India. As already told you that during 1980s, India experienced a huge amount of fiscal deficit, which forced the central government to finance the fiscal deficit by borrowings from the central bank, which is called the Reserve Bank of India. In order to finance the government, Reserve Bank of India printed new money notes, which led to the increase in money supply in the economy. Increase in money supply pushed up the inflation level in the economy, thereby making the domestic goods more expensive. The rate of inflation rose from 6.7% per annum to 10.3% per annum during 1980s to 1990 to 91. In order to lower the rate of inflation, Indian government in 1991 had to opt for economic reforms. And lastly, poor performance of public sector undertakings also compelled the Indian government to revise the entire strategy of growth and opt for economic reforms. As already discussed that before 1990, public sector undertakings were given the major role in the industrialization of Indian economy. Several thousand crores of rupees were invested in the growth of public sector undertakings. In the initial 10 to 15 years, their performance was quite satisfactory, but thereafter, most of the public sector undertakings started making losses. Instead of being a revenue generator for the central government, the public sector undertakings became the liability. The Sikh public sector undertakings added an extra financial burden on the government budget. So, on account of the factors discussed so far, the economic reforms in India became inevitable. Consequently, in July 1991, the then Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, along with his Finance Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh, initiated the economic reforms in India in order to remove the inefficiencies in the economic system. In this connection, India approached International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, popularly known as World Bank, and International Monetary Fund, that is IMF, and received $7 billion as loan to manage the crisis. International agencies, that is World Bank and IMF, however, expected India to liberalize and open up the Indian economy by removing industrial and trade restrictions. India agreed to the conditions of World Bank and IMF and had announced new economic policy which consists of wide range of economic reforms. The main objectives of New Economic Policy 1991 were to reduce fiscal deficit as it was very high and to have relative price stability, to reduce the area of operation of the public sector and to open up more areas for the private sector, to liberalize industrial policy and abolish industrial licensing system for most of the private sector industries, to encourage inflow of foreign capital by granting more concessions to foreign direct investment, and to liberalize foreign trade by reducing tariff rates and abolishing quota restrictions in case of many imports. The measures adopted in the new economic policy can be broadly classified into two groups, that is, the stabilization measures and structural reforms. Stabilization measures were short-term measures as it was necessary in the short run to restore the balance of payments equilibrium and to control the inflation. The immediate and top priority of the government was to stabilize the economy, bring the growth of the economy to its normal track, and to win back confidence of international financial community. Structural reforms, on the other hand, were long-term measures which aimed at improving the efficiency of the economy and increasing its international competitiveness by removing the rigidity in various segments of the Indian economy. In the new economic policy of 1991, structural reforms can be seen with respect to liberalization of Indian economy, privatization of Indian economy, and globalization of Indian economy. So, the structural reforms are categorized as liberalization, privatization, and globalization, that is the LPG. We will discuss the structural reforms of LPG, that is liberalization, privatization, and globalization, in a much greater detail in our coming lectures. Thank you.